Hello.
Hello. Good morning. Today, we're seeing a wide, vocal, urgent push, a yearning, a vocal outcry on the inside and outside the tech world for digital well-being. And this morning, we're here to discuss this nascent movement with a special focus on the responsibility and the role of inventors and developers. Glen's been a leader in recent initiatives to help users gain better relationships with their technology. And I'd also like to start by saying there's kind of an unresolved, quality to this discussion, this national yearning. We're torn and uneasy. 70% of Americans say that the technology has overall improved their quality of life. And yet, the equal numbers say it's making us lazy and distracted. So we're reveling in the wonders in our pockets and yet pushing back on the excesses, such as dependency. We just heard of hyperconnectivity and eroded opportunities for reflection. And I call this the reluctant backlash. So Glen, tell us what Google's internal research is showing about what people are feeling, and also, how is Google trying to help people get a handle on, their relationship with these devices?
Sure. As the Android platform team, we've been investigating people's relationship to technology for a long time. And over the past several years, we've been looking at the role of notifications in people's lives. I think we all sort of have a relationship with notifications, something that we all think about. And we traveled the world. Our research teams went out and spent hours just observing people throughout their day in different parts of the world, Europe, Asia, Africa, etc. And we just watched how people used their phones. And it went from being something that was just about notifications to more about how people think about the devices in their pocket, with their overall relationship with technology. And it was really interesting. What we found was that phones are incredibly useful. I think we sort of all realize this. They've displaced so many of the other things in our lives. We don't need to carry maps around anymore. We can use them to contact people. And that was really interesting. So people did talk about how useful they were, but it also meant that they couldn't put them away. You always had to have your phone with you because it was providing utility to you throughout the day. Sort of without it, you felt naked. And then as we observed people, and we started to look at the other side of it, when people started to feel bad about their use of the phone, we noticed two things. The first was sort of an internal struggle that people had, which is, Kevin sort of touched on some of this stuff before, is like you'd open an app or something and enjoy using it, but then it was kind of hard to put down. You would just keep using it. I think this is somewhat like TV, where it's easy to sit down, start watching The Simpsons, and then the next show comes on, and then the next show, and then before you know it, you're watching late-night infomercials, and it's kind of like, oh, is this really a good use of my time? And so there was that internal struggle that people had. And I think the other part was, and I think this was surprising to us, although in hindsight it shouldn't have been, was the external triggers. I think we'd gone into it thinking about how notifications from apps and so on would sort of cause you to pick up your phone. But what we found was that because we're social people, and the phone is our conduit to our social network, there was this expectation of reachability. There was this expectation that if someone contacts you, you get back to them straight away. And that created a large source of stress for people. In addition to needing your phone nearby for its utility, you always needed it there in order to respond to people. And I think one of the interesting parts was those two triggers relate to each other. Someone sends you a message, you respond to them straight away, it's a little bit stressful, and then you start going and doing something else. And one leads to the other. Sometimes that something else that you do is send someone else a message and triggering them to send something else. And I think that part was really interesting to us because it's such a social thing. It's something that had existed before in the times of just telephones. I think we talked about it with email and so on. And so that's kind of what we ended up discovering. The phone is there because it's useful. People keep using it because it's useful. But this external social trigger was really tough. And I think that the thing that was interesting for us was that even the research team and ourselves, we would sit there and be like, oh man, it's really bad that people have this expectation that they need to get back to someone within 5 minutes. Like, surely, like, why do people do that? And then the next question we asked ourselves was like, well, if you contacted your family member and they didn't get back to you in 5 minutes, how would you feel about that?
Right.
And everyone was like, that would be terrible.
Yeah.
It would not be okay.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't essentially an off button anymore. I mean,
That's
the
right.
off button is sort of a hypothetical thing. And you created product designs that help people gain a kind of a mirror on this behavior. Not the same thing as Kevin, the Moment app, but metrics, I understand, a way for people to understand metrics. And I also have to add that I think this is very urgent business. It seems as though awareness is sort of peripheral or maybe optional, but in a time when saturation becomes, we've gone from adoption to saturation to the idea that tech is a given and the boundaries are blurring between us and technology. It becomes all the more difficult to gain that perspective, which is the starting point to understanding what we want, how we want to go forward. I mean, a third of smartphone owners, according to one study, say that they rate the device as close or closer to themselves as many of their friends. Mm-hmm. And in the cognitive sphere, people are now rating themselves better at locating information than at thinking through a problem through themselves. Mm. So technology becomes us, and that segues the internal struggle that connects that internal struggle and the external social fabric of social obligations again. So what are you doing to help us?
Yeah. So we talked about reflection a little bit, and I think. We announced some products at I/O, and Kevin has Moment, which we heard about earlier. And I think that for us, providing awareness and control to people is really important. And I think it's easy to sort of say, like, oh, okay, the statistics about how much you use your phone, does that really matter? But I think for us, we found that it actually does matter a lot, because we, as an anecdote, we as a team had sort of sat there and we were like, yeah, we see a lot of people who struggle with using their phone a little bit too much. Let's build this tool, and then maybe that will help them. And then we built it, and we found it useful for ourselves. As an example, we had seen statistics around like the number of times a day someone unlocks their phone, and it was in over 100 in some cases. And we were like, wow, who are those people? That's a lot of usage of your phone. That's a lot of unlocking. And then the moment we built the tool, we were like, oh, it's us. And so, I think for many of us, that led to a moment of reflection, which I think is really important, because with a moment of reflection, then you can start to think about how you would like to engage and use technology. And I think that's where we can start to provide controls and tools to enable people to get to the state that they want to be in.
Right. And of course, humans are the least, we're supposedly the most self-aware, and yet we are absolutely categorically, I can text and drive. So, we're looking not only for awareness as a starting point, but to solutions. So what are some of the solutions? And also, if technology is part of the solution that makes sense, at the same time, a skeptic might say, turning to technology to solve the problems, sown by technology, how are we going to even, trust the inventors? Or what do you say to skeptics? And what have you created to push us on this little bit of a path here?
Multiple paths to that. I think Nia actually talked about some of it as well, which was that sort of we're in the business of building things that are useful for people. Mm-hmm. That's what we as individuals on the team want to do, and I think that it's really important for us to feel that we've built something I think that people love. I think that's what motivates us, and I think in the long term that's good for business. You don't want people burning out on the things that you're building. So I think that's why we take this responsibility very, very deeply, and why it's so core to what we do.
Yeah. And I also think that it's important to understand when we're taking meta views that the commoditization of attention is not a new thing. It dates back hundreds of years. Yeah. There was an incredible, Walter Benjamin wrote about the Kaiser Panorama, which was literally a multiplayer, so to speak, virtual reality, so to speak, cinematic slideshow machine that was franchised across Europe, in about 1890. And so this idea of the buying and selling of human absorption is going to continue. The marketplace, should be rethought, re-envisioned. Maybe there are solutions. Maybe the success, engagement as a success metric needs to be changed. But that makes it all the more, this problem or this dilemma or this challenge or opportunity makes it all the more important to create devices that actually promote human autonomy, as well as, again, as we've heard a little bit this morning, demanding of ourselves the accountability to promote our own autonomy. So I think that, taking the big picture is part of that. So in closing, or do you want to add anything more about the JOMO, the joy of missing out philosophy, and where, and particularly where you see this headed? What is the vision that either you personally or Google have for digital well-being 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think that this is something we talk about a lot, and maybe to your earlier point as well, technology is a magnifier in many ways. It doesn't stand alone in its helping you interact with other people. And I think one of the things that we really think about is that because of the external triggers I mentioned before, people from your social network contacting you, this is a conversation that we should be having with each other. There's only so much that your phone can do in terms of mediating a relationship with other people. And I think that it is a really tricky challenge. I think some of us can work in workplaces where there is a no email after 5 policy, and that's great. That will help in some ways, but then we might have social networks, many different social networks, different groups of friends who have different expectations of reachability. And how do we move the conversation as a society and culture forward so that we can start to set global expectations about things like reachability and so on, so that we can actually get to the joy of missing out without having the fear of missing out, so that we can feel like we are doing the right thing by our friends and so on, without feeling like we're letting them down.
Mm-hmm. And last night we were talking a little bit about that vision of, where digital fits in our lives. And could you share, a little bit of what you were saying about, in essence, what does it mean to be human? Is blending, I heard earlier this morning about the algorithm versus the humanitarian, but that's an important point. But, the blending of human and machine is so upon us. What do you see as, what we should be aiming for while keeping it loose?
Yeah. Kevin also touched on this morning. I think that many of us we have many digital relationships in our lives. We have people who we primarily communicate with over digital media. And I think that one of the tensions we feel is in-person communication and conversation is key, and many of us feel like we're starting to miss out on that a little bit. And I think that that's a really important conversation to be had. I think one of the things that we probably should spend a little time focusing on or talking about is, like, on the digital side, what are we actually gaining? Like, what is things like SMS Kevin talked about is really useful for organizing things, and I think there's a certain class of things that wouldn't be organized if it wasn't for things like SMS. I think Howard Rheingold used to talk about this, organizing groups of people, and so I think that there's a super positive side to this about, like, what technology is actually enabling for people that I think is a really important part of the conversation, because as we start to adjust things in products or our cultures, I think there are many things that we actually don't want to throw away, that we want to keep. And I think it's really important that we start to really share a viewpoint of, like, what are the interactions that we are having digitally that are really important for us to maintain.
Yeah, and it's so important to keep our eyes open and keep that meta understanding and keep awake to it all. That's right. And I also think that it's interesting that, in this multiple thread conversation about digital well-being or humanity, is escape from the digital really how we want to frame it. For instance, the value systems related to efficiency and productivity and instantaneity that we see as so purely expressed in the digital, again, have been coming up for hundreds of years that certainly in Western parts of the world are, dominant and that affect us offline. So is really escape from technology the ultimate goal? And I think that that's a really, important question, because human flourishing should speak to the other side of ourselves, the sides of ourselves such as the digressive, deliberative, slow, uncertain parts of ourselves, which are now scientifically being proven to be tremendous avenues to wisdom and to creativity. So I think that there's not only the fast, algorithmic side and intuitive to a certain extent that speaks to the device, and the device exacerbates, but maybe there's another quiet side of ourselves that should be brought out of the shadows. I think I'll just read one tiny quote to end from Langdon Winner, a technology critic, who wrote, "The important question about technology is, as we make things work, what kind of world are we making? Are we going to design and build circumstances that enlarge possibilities for growth in human freedom, sociability, intelligence, creativity, and self-government, or are we headed in an altogether different direction?" And he wrote those words in 1983, and they still pose a challenge to us all. So thank you so much, Glenn, for those thoughts and visions, and thank you all.
Thank you.